Thank you so much for this invitation to present at this very interesting meeting. I'm looking forward to having some discussion about what we will be talking about today. To start with, I want to remind you of this quote from Shakespeare's play, The Tempest, where Antonio says to Sebastian, "What's past is prologue." The phrase is often used to suggest that history sets the context for what is happening now. But the part that comes next, quote, "what to come in yours and my discharge," unquote, is often overlooked, but actually more important because what happens in the future depends on each of us. The story is told that Supreme Court Justice William O. Douglas was riding in the back of a cab in Washington, D.C. As they were passing the National Archives building, Justice Douglas noticed the words, "What's past is prologue," chiseled on the front of the building. Knowing that cab drivers in DC had a reputation for having an opinion on everything, he asked the cab driver what he thought those words meant. The cabbie hesitated for a second and then replied, "We ain't seen nothing yet." Today, I will talk about newborn hearing screening, about past accomplishments that set the context for future advances, and about how each of us have work to do to make these accomplishments possible. I hope by the time I've finished, you too will agree that we ain't seen nothing yet. If we look at a representative sample from the population in the United States of newborn babies, then the incidence of congenital hearing loss per 10,000 births will be about 30 for children with hearing loss, compared to only 11 for those with Down syndrome, or 1 with phenylketonuria. So congenital hearing loss is the most frequent condition for which we can screen babies at birth. To give you an idea of the demographics, if we look at data reported by the Centers for Disease Control and Prevention from the early hearing detection and intervention programs, which exist in every state, then we see that only about 20% of newborn babies who are identified with hearing loss have bilateral, severe, or profound hearing loss. The vast majority of babies have unilateral loss or mild bilateral loss or mild or moderate bilateral loss. And what I want you to get from this is that the population of babies who are being identified in early hearing detection and intervention programs is a very heterogeneous group of babies. And what happens to those babies is quite different depending on the degree and laterality of the hearing loss that they have. To provide just a little more historical context, this is a statue of Helen Keller. Each state has the opportunity to have 2 statues in the Capitol Rotunda. Several years ago, the state of Alabama decided to replace one of their statues with a statue of Helen Keller, who is depicted here at the moment that she realized that words have meaning. She's standing by a water pump, and as the water comes out, she understands that that's what water is. Now, Helen Keller was a remarkable person. Even though she was both deaf and blind, she learned to communicate very effectively and became a very involved social activist and lecturer. And she was able to do all of this because of her ability to communicate with other people. Later in her life, she was asked whether deafness or blindness was the more difficult disability for her. And her answer surprised a lot of people. She said that deafness was far worse than blindness. And the reason she gave is at the core of why newborn hearing screening programs are so important. She said blindness separates people from things, but deafness separates people from people. So it's this ability to communicate with other people is why we want to identify babies as soon as possible and provide them with the assistance they need to learn how to communicate. Children who are deaf and hard of hearing communicate in many different ways. And it's not that one way is better than another, but people need to decide how they want to communicate. Some people choose to use sign language. American Sign Language is the most frequent signing system used in this country. Other families choose to use listening and spoken language. And there are other kinds of methods as well. The important thing is to make sure that whatever the family wants to use as a way of communicating, that they receive the support and assistance that they need. And it's not always a single decision. Some families may choose to use listening and spoken language in the beginning and then switch to sign language later on, or do a combination of both of them. I'm going to play a couple of video clips now to give you an example of what happens when people choose different communication modes. This first clip is of a family that adopted two little boys from China when they were about 6 months old. When the boys were adopted, they had no language at all, neither Chinese nor English. They are both deaf children, and they are growing up in a family where the father is deaf and the mother is hearing, but American Sign Language is the language in the home. And so they've been exposed to this for about a year at this point when this video was made. The family is in their car leaving a car repair shop. Watch what happens. Okay, so in this video, they're just leaving the car repair shop. The one little boy says, "The car's up high, it's going higher." His brother says, "Hey Dad, look over there. I see the car moving up. It's going higher and higher." Brother says, "Hey Mom, is someone driving that car?" "There are many cars and they're shaking." The little boy says, "Yes, I love you, Mom." The mom signs back, "I really love you." And then he responds to her. His brother says, "We'll be there soon." "Hey, look over there." "Yeah, it's an airplane. I see it and it's flying." "Yeah, an airplane flying." "Hey Dad, pay attention to me. Trains go fast. I'm looking for a propeller. Where is it?" "Yeah, where is one?" I don't know." "Up in the sky?" "I don't know." "A helicopter." "A helicopter? Where's a helicopter?" "Up in the sky?" I don't know." I don't know either. "There was one here before. Where is it?" Now, what do you notice about this video? These two little boys have extraordinary language. Many people think of sign language as a system that just has labels for different hand shapes for different words. But it's really a complete language with its own syntax and grammar and morphology. And people who are fluent in sign language can communicate every bit as well as people communicating in any other language. It's truly remarkable that these little boys, after only a year of being exposed to sign language, have such effective communication. They can look into the future, they can remember what happened in the past, they can introduce new topics. So this is one of the ways that children who are deaf learn to communicate. Now I'd like to play an audio clip of a little girl from this class. This is from 1977. And this class is a listening and spoken language class. Those are battery packs that children are wearing in front of them for their hearing aids. And this little girl, who has a severe bilateral loss, so she has some hearing and uses hearing aids to amplify that, is talking to us. Listen carefully and see if you can see what she said. Begin to grow. Now, I suspect most of you had a great deal of difficulty and that you probably hardly understood anything, if anything at all. So let me play that again with a visual clue. Begin to grow. Now, with the visual clue, you can probably get most of it. What we're listening to here is what's often referred to as deaf speech. It has a certain tonal quality and cadence to it. But with the visual clue, you're understanding most of what she's saying, which is similar to what her family, as they became accustomed to the tone and quality of the speech, could understand. But for other people, when she went to school, when she went to the neighborhood grocery store, when she was playing with other children in her area, they probably have the reaction that we had when we first listened to it. And it's very difficult to understand. This is kind of where we were 40 years ago, but a lot has changed since then. I'm going to play a clip now of what's happening today. This next video is of two 6-year-old boys who have profound hearing loss in both ears. So it's actually a much more serious loss than the little girl we just listened to. This video was made by AJ's mother to introduce the boys to their classmates on the first day that they attended their neighborhood school. Listen to them.
Hey, I'm AJ. Yeah! Hi, my name is Gibson. People are special in different ways. One of the things that makes me feel special is that I'm deaf. I'm deaf too, and deaf means that your ears can't hear. AJ and I have special things to show you. They're called cochlear implants. They help us hear. Cochlear implant is a big word, so I call them CIs. C is for cochlear, and the I is for implant. CIs are amazing because they're like bionic ears. Sometimes my friends have questions about my CI. Hey, how does that thing stick to your head? There's a magnet inside. When it's on, voila, I can hear.
Now, actually, there's a little more than just voila, I can hear. But the point of this video is that because of advances in technology, children and their families who choose listening and spoken language have many more options and are much more successful than they were 20 or 30 years ago. So how did we get from where we were 40 years ago to where we are today? Whether children are choosing listening and spoken language or American Sign Language or cued speech or total communication, there are three things that I think have contributed to us being able to achieve so much better outcomes. First is earlier identification of hearing loss, and we'll be talking more about newborn hearing screening. But at the same time, we've had big improvements in hearing technology, digital hearing aids, FM system, cochlear implants that enable us to take advantage of that earlier identification period. And then third, we know a lot more now about how to teach language and how to support families as they learn language in whatever language system they choose. And all of these things have interacted with each other to enable us to have the kinds of outcomes that you just saw. Let's talk first about newborn hearing screening. So the first large-scale clinical trial of universal newborn hearing screening was conducted by our center here at Utah State University from 1988 to 1993, often referred to as the Rhode Island Hearing Assessment Project. It demonstrated that we really could screen all babies for hearing loss, and that by doing that, we were able to identify children at much younger ages. Based on the results of that study and several others, the National Institutes of Health held a consensus development conference in March of 1993. And they concluded that all babies should be screened for hearing loss, and that this could be accomplished most efficiently by screening prior to discharge from either the well baby or the NICU. And so we assumed, many of us, that we would rapidly move towards universal newborn hearing screening. At the time that this consensus development conference was held, only about 6% of all babies were being screened. And it took almost another 10 years for us to reach the point where we're now screening 98 to 99% of all babies. For those of you who haven't seen newborn hearing screening done, I'm going to play a short clip that is taken from an educational video we developed for families in prenatal classes to show them how hearing screening is done.
Sophia.
How can your baby's hearing be checked? Thanks to advances in technology, we can now check a baby's hearing shortly after birth. Your healthcare staff is concerned about your newborn's hearing because 1 out of every 300 babies is born with a hearing loss. Children who cannot hear clearly will often have trouble learning to communicate. That's why it is important to check or screen each newborn's hearing using one of 2 safe, simple, and painless procedures. Let's watch an example of each. One method is called OAE, or otoacoustic emissions screening. In this process, a trained screener places a small earphone in the baby's ear that emits a series of soft sounds. The inner ear typically responds to these sounds by producing echoes called otoacoustic emissions, which are analyzed by the screening equipment. Another method is called AABR, or Automated Auditory Brainstem Response Screening. In this process, a trained screener places Band-Aid-like sensors on the baby's head. As soft sounds are played into the baby's ear, these sensors analyze the brain's response to the sound. No matter which method is used, in a few minutes the screening is finished and the result is displayed.
So the equipment really is simple to use, and it continues to get even more user-friendly, although the basic technology that is being used to screen babies has remained the same for the last 20 years. Because of newborn hearing screening, we've been able to dramatically reduce the age at which children with permanent hearing loss are identified. In the 80s and 90s, it was about 2.5 to 3 years of age. Now the average age is down to 2 to 3 to 4 months of age. As we started doing universal newborn hearing screening, there was a lot of effort put into what the best protocols were, who should do the screening, what equipment should be used. And there was almost the assumption, although it was never spoken, that once we finished screening, the process was finished. Then some sort of miracle would occur and babies would receive all the services that they need. But we soon realized that there was still a lot of work that needed to be done in this area. We needed to figure out how to diagnose these babies who were 2 and 3 weeks of age, to enroll them in early intervention programs, to coordinate all that with the medical home, to create data management systems so babies could be tracked and followed efficiently, to evaluate our outcomes, and perhaps most importantly, to provide appropriate family support. Now, we've come a long ways during that last 25 years, but there's still work to do. What I'd like to focus on now is how what we've accomplished is the precursor for what needs to happen and what our role in that is. I'm going to identify 5 areas that I think are the 5 of the areas where the biggest benefits can be realized as we move forward. So first of all, let's look at what happens with children after that newborn period. These data come from the National Health and Nutrition Examination Survey, and depending on the year that the data were collected, you can see that instead of identifying 2 or 3 babies per 1,000, now we're identifying 7 to 10 babies per 1,000. So there's 4 to 5 times as many children who develop hearing loss after that newborn period as are being identified with hearing loss from the newborn hearing screening. So we're doing a very good job with hospital-based screening, but there's more that needs to be done. So one of the questions we need to always be asking ourselves is, what's our safety net for those babies who are either missed in the newborn hearing screening, of which there are a few, or babies who develop hearing loss at an early age? So There are a number of studies. I've cited several here. In this study, 4,500 children were screened, and they were able to identify another 1.6 babies per thousand with permanent hearing loss. Interestingly, 4 of those babies passed the newborn hearing screening, which suggests that they developed hearing loss later. 2 of them were not screened as newborns for whatever reason, and 1 baby failed the newborn hearing screening but didn't follow up. Here's a couple of other studies that have looked at this with a significant number of children. Study number 2 screened 2,000 children, identified about 2.5 children per thousand with permanent hearing loss. These are children after they had left the hospital. These were children who were visiting federally qualified health centers. In a third study, and the references are at the bottom here, there were about 850 children screened, 3.5 children per thousand identified with permanent hearing loss. So finding ways to identify these children who are either missed in the hospital period or who develop hearing loss later is a very important task that we need to do more with. On our website, kidshearing.org, there are a lot of materials that can help people in moving forward with this, but we need much more attention given to this area. The second activity I'd like to talk about is the expansion of telehealth or telepractices. This little boy has a bilateral profound hearing loss, is wearing cochlear implants. He receives all of his early intervention services through a 2-way video conferencing with his mother at home and a therapist on the other side of the television. I'd like to play another little clip of this same little boy when he was just starting the program to give you an idea of how teleintervention happens.
Hi.
Hi, Alex. Hi.
He's looking up. So why don't you just present the sound, Nancy, and then we'll see if he's, has any reaction just to your voice.
So a graduate student and her advisor here.
You just want to present the sound first, and then we'll see if he looks and starts turning to you or anything like that. Perfect. Awesome.
He looked right at you.
Awesome.
Need a toy?
Yeah. So he looked up, so he can the reward.
Whoa! Oh.
He's never done that before.
He shoots, he scores.
Yes! That was amazing.
That is really the first time I've seen that.
That's great.
So the goal of teleintervention is to provide tools and support to the family members so that they can interact with the child in ways that elicit and reinforce language development in all of their daily activities, so that early intervention isn't just something that happens for 1 hour a week. It happens every day throughout the day, and children make much quicker progress. When we started doing teleintervention, we hoped that we could demonstrate that teleintervention would be just as effective as face-to-face intervention. But now, after a number of different studies, several of them randomized trials, we've been able to show that children in teleintervention programs actually make more progress than children in face-to-face early intervention programs because the families are engaging in those activities for a much greater amount of time. Again, for those who are interested in looking at telehealth as a resource for newborn hearing screening and intervention programs, our website at infanthearing.org has many resources for both teleintervention and teleaudiology. The third area I'd like to talk about is something called cytomegalovirus, congenital cytomegalovirus. This is something which many people are not aware of, even though about 1 in every 200 children are born with cytomegalovirus each year. And about 20% of those who have congenital cytomegalovirus will develop permanent problems. Many people are unaware of the problems that are caused by cytomegalovirus, which are significant. So this comes from a study done by the Centers for Disease Control in their health style survey. They asked a nationally representative sample which of these following conditions they had heard of, and then they looked at what the incidence of those conditions were. Alarmingly, they found that cytomegalovirus, which affects about 6,000 children every year, less than 7% of the respondents had ever heard of cytomegalovirus. When you compare that to something like spina bifida with only a quarter as many cases, 10 times as many people have heard of it. Or Down syndrome, which has about the same incidence, 85% had heard of it. Now, cytomegalovirus is a frequently occurring virus that for most people doesn't cause any problems at all. All of us listening to this presentation today have probably been exposed to cytomegalovirus. And unless it affects a woman while she's pregnant, then it has symptoms of a very mild cold. But if a woman contracts it while she's pregnant, then there is a much higher incidence of it being transferred to the baby, and that it causes serious problems. If of the 20,000 babies born each year with cytomegalovirus, about 3,600 of them will be or become deaf or hard of hearing over the first few years of life. 1,000 of them will have cerebral palsy, and about 600 of them will have vision impairment. There are efforts now in about 12 different states to screen babies who fail the newborn hearing screening test for cytomegalovirus. But ultimately, I think we need to be looking at figuring out ways to do universal screening for cytomegalovirus, perhaps linking it to the dried blood spot, and so that we can detect all of the babies who have congenital cytomegalovirus. The fourth area I want to talk about briefly are advances in genetic screening. Most of you listening on this call already know that about 60% of all congenital hearing loss has a genetic basis, is linked to a genetic mutation. If we could test all babies for those genetic mutations, even the most common occurring genetic mutations, although there are hundreds of mutations that are linked to hearing loss, less than a dozen of those probably account for 90% of all congenital hearing loss. If we could do universal screening for those genetic mutations, then we would avoid unnecessary and often costly tests, which are now used to make sure that babies don't have some of these problems. We would be able to dispel misinformation and offer emotional support to parents who have a child born with hearing loss, that they will understand that it's in most cases not something that they did or didn't do. We could also anticipate potential health problems that are linked with some of these mutations which cause deafness, such as heart problems and kidney problems. And finally, we can determine the chances for hearing loss in subsequent children. Although some people think this is very important, in my opinion, these other reasons for doing genetic screening are even more important. And this is something which we are really very close to being able to do. In a recent work group convened by the American College for Medical Genetics, they looked at the evidence for what it would take to combine genetic screening based on the dried blood spot with the physiological screen we do now, and then also incorporating screening for congenital cytomegalovirus. And they concluded that it was realistic. In many ways, in my opinion, we're at the same location or the same place where we were with newborn hearing screening back in the late 80s and early 90s. That's where we are with genetic screening today. We've demonstrated how to do it. We have the tools to do it. We just have to have some large-scale implementation and be able to demonstrate how successful it can be. And as we do that and get more and more implementations, I'm sure that the cost will begin to come down. Other countries are already doing that. China, for example, has published a number of studies with very large groups of children. This 2020 study included almost 250,000 infants that received both physiological hearing screening and genetic screening. This study, which was done in 2019, screened 1.2 million newborns using both physiological screening and genetic screening. Both of them were able to demonstrate the ability to find additional children who would have been missed by the physiological screen, as well as collecting information about genetic mutations that then became very important for the medical and audiological management of the children. The fifth area I'd like to talk about briefly is the global status of newborn and infant hearing screening. This comes from a survey published in 2020, in which the authors attempted to ascertain in every country in the world what was happening with newborn hearing screening. We have lots of examples right now of where effective screening programs are happening in various countries. Not yet all countries. This graphic shows in the light green those countries that reported that they were screening 85 to 100% of all of their newborns. As you can see, there are still a lot of places which are not yet screening. About a third of the babies in the world are born in countries that are screening 85 to 100%. About 40% are born in countries that are screening less than 1%. So we still have a long ways to go, but we have seen published studies in many countries, both relatively well-to-do countries as well as developing countries, that are being effective in implementation of universal newborn screening programs. So let's go back to where we started. Shakespeare's quote from The Tempest: "What's past is prologue, what to come in yours and my discharge." I've identified 5 areas where I think there's potential to significantly improve early identification and better treatment of children who are deaf or hard of hearing, both those with congenital hearing loss and those with late identified hearing loss. But for us to make improvements in each of those areas will require coordinated and focused effort from a lot of different people. It will require funding from federal agencies such as the National Institutes of Health, the Department of Education, the Department of Health and Human Services. We have certainly established the foundation on which progress in each of these areas can be made, but there's still a great deal of work that needs to be done. The Newborn Screening Translational Research Network has been instrumental in the advances that have been made during the last 30 years, and that kind of collaborative work from many different agencies and many different disciplines is exactly the kind of thing we need to keep moving forward. I'm sure there will be other areas beyond these 5 that need further attention and in which further progress is possible. We have appreciated the opportunities we've had to work with the Newborn Screening Translational Research Network. This group is particularly well suited to making advances in terms of the identification and services to children who are deaf and hard of hearing, because they bring together people from multiple perspectives, multiple disciplines representing different agencies. Certainly the work that will move forward with early identification of hearing loss depends on having all of those different points of view. And we are excited about the progress that has already been made. And optimistic about the potential for additional progress. That progress will require participation from our federal partners, who will be able to provide support to do scientific, well-founded research, but it will also depend on many other groups that are able to establish the community connections and to work with people from across the spectrum to provide the best services for children who are deaf and hard of hearing. Our website contains resources for many of the areas which I've discussed, and this website is based on input from literally dozens and dozens of organizations that are committed to earlier and better identification and services for children who are deaf and hard of hearing and their families. Thank you for your attention. I look forward to working with many of you and am happy to respond to questions if you have them. Thanks so much.